Let's get started. So, welcome. I apologize for those technical difficulties. I'm going to move us over here so the captioning is visible. Okay, thank you so much for your patience. I'm sorry for the late start. My name is Beth Reel, and I am the transition coordinator for the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center. And this is the second webinar in our transition to adult life webinar and Facebook Live series. So the first part one was transition and the law. That is available on CPAC's website under online learning opportunities. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that and you're interested, you can go ahead and view that at your convenience. So today we will be talking about transition and the IEP, the Individualized Education Program. So this webinar was not meant to be the be-all and end-all, every little detail of the IEP, but it will, my slides are not advancing now. It will cover the basic pages, the most important pages of the IEP. That's not to say that there aren't some other pages that include transition planning, but for the purposes of a shortened webinar, we just picked out the most important pages, the ones that we use the most, the ones that we send parents to look at the most. So it will be a brief overview. If you have questions, there is a Q&A section, I believe, that shows up on your screen, also the chat box. And if you are viewing on Facebook Live, again, I apologize for the delay there as well. And you can type your questions in. Last time some people asked some questions and I didn't get to them until after, but I have somebody else monitoring Facebook today. So I should be able to get to the questions. So the first part of the webinar, the first 20 to 30 minutes, I will be going through the IEP document, and then I will take questions after. So we want to get through the content of the webinar first. So, what I hope that you will take away is a better understanding of the IEP and how it relates to transition planning. So I always start pretty much every presentation I do. If you were on the transition and the law webinar, then you saw this as the first slide as well. But I think it's really important as we think about students transitioning to, out of district services and to the adult world. So I put bold typeface on the part of the law that says to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And so this is the whole purpose of the law. This is the whole purpose of special education. This is why we do what we do, because we are working to prepare students to exit and move on to the adult world, whatever that may look like for that individual student. So transition planning, as also was mentioned in the last webinar, is done through a PPT meeting, planning and placement team meeting, also called an IEP meeting. And this is really where the IEP is supposed to be put together. That's not saying that it can't be worked on prior to the PPT meeting. But when we start transition planning, at the IEP, the PPT meeting before the student turns 16 or 14, depending on whether they're a student with autism or not. The majority of the transition planning should be done through the PPT meeting. This is where goals and objectives are developed. Again, sometimes we do that beforehand, but we get to the meeting and we agree on these goals and objectives, hopefully. So this is really where the meat of the document should be created. And then of course the student should, must be invited to attend, but as much as possible should be a major driver of the goals and objectives. You know, at this point, we're looking at where the student is going, what they want to do, not what we want them to do or what we think they should do. So not only must they be invited to attend, but we hope that they have a leading role in the development of the goals and objectives. So here is page 4 of the IEP document. So pages, I'm just going to flip back and forth for a second. So page 4 and page 5 go together. And so they are really the foundational pages of the IEP. And so this isn't just for transition planning. This is for any student who has this IEP document, any student receiving special education services. Pages 4 and 5 are the foundational pages. It's where we gather all the information together about the student's strengths and their needs and the impact of the student's disability on their education. And we create goals and objectives, and we go from here. So these are, like I said, the foundational pages. So what should be reported on pages 4 and 5? So they're called the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance pages, also fondly known as the PLOP pages, P-L-O-P. And we should gather together information from many places. So oftentimes we see the evaluation data is reported on these pages. So if there has been and there should have been a formal evaluation, things like IQ, academic achievement, those things should be reported on these pages. But if you look up at the top under the title, just move my cursor up there, you'll see that the information on these pages should also come from a variety of different places. So it can be classroom performance, it can be observation, it can be the parent and student reports, can be the teacher reports, obviously. And then looking at things like smarter balance assessment and alternative assessments. So a variety of different places. When we're talking about transition, we have some transition assessments which we will touch on a little bit further into the presentation, but that should also be a part of present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So the next part of page 4, you'll see parent and student input and concerns. And so oftentimes when an IEP comes across my desk, I see very little written here. And when we're talking about transition, we really want to think about not only the parents' input, but especially the students' input, because like I said earlier, excuse me, sorry. Like I said earlier, if possible, the student should be the driver of the IEP as much as possible. Sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. And so what can be written here? So things that work, things that don't work, if there are strategies that are not reported other places in the IEP, we could perhaps add something like that here. There might be some things that the parent or the student would want the teacher or the the team to know about that student. So We may have tried some things that didn't work in the past. There may be things that a parent or student are asking for that are not resolved at one particular PPT meeting. And so that would be important to add. The student or parent may write a statement about their dreams, their hopes for the future, and add this to the parent and student input and concerns. And if it doesn't fit in this section, it can be added to the IEP document as well. That's the first part. And then as you look down into the second part, you'll see page 4 generally deals with the academic parts of a person's education, and so of a student's education. So we see the language arts, the math, and other academic and non-academic areas. So information in the area, it says briefly describe the current performance. And so this section generally has things like test scores, IQ scores, academic achievement scores. Then the next column, we hopefully list areas of strength for this student. And so this is important because when we look at ways to support this person, we can use strengths to help support a person in the area of concerns and needs. So, so strengths, what do they do really well? We can also use strengths to really help a person know that they have these positive areas and things that they are successful at. And then concerns and needs column, anything in these specific areas of language arts, math, or other non-academic areas that are concerns or needs, information that comes out of the testing or from one of these places listed above. And then the impact of the disability on the student's involvement in education. And then page 5 is generally the more functional areas. And so that's not to say that all of these things don't impact the academic areas, because clearly they do. When you look at things like behavior, social, emotional, communication, vocational and transition, and health and development, all of the areas listed on page 5. But these are the areas we may be focusing on when we talk about that functional performance. And so same thing here, listing current performance based on evaluations, assessments, things like that. And then listing student strengths, listing concerns and needs, and the impact of the disability on education. So as we look at these pages to help drive transition planning, a couple of things to note that I see frequently. One is I don't always see all of the information that would be helpful pulled from evaluations and put on this page for a variety of different reasons. So it's helpful when you're looking at pages 4 and 5 to also have evaluation data, assessments, and things like that, so that you can have a better understanding of the student's needs. And then this concerns and needs column is really what drives the goals and objectives. So that's not just for transition planning, that's for all students with an IEP. We look at those concerns and needs to help look at the different areas that we need to address then to help this person to transition successfully to the adult world. Okay. So I mentioned transition assessment. This is different than formal evaluations. And so the Transition Task Force came up with this definition back in 2008. I'm not sure that it's being changed. We're actually working on, I'm a member of the Transition Task Force, and we're working on a new assessment manual And there is a new transition manual coming out very, very soon. But for now, transition assessment is an ongoing process of gathering information. And we highlight ongoing because it's not just a one and done type assessment. So this helps us, the student, and the support people, the professionals and family members, to help the student to plan for their life in the future, whatever that may be. There we go. So we look at these assessments, and typically where you would go to see if any assessments have been completed is page 6, the transition planning page. So I think it's the next one. Let me see. No, we're going to get to that in a minute. So we want the transition assessments to be current. So hopefully we have some that are completed within the previous year. For a student who's new to transition planning, that wouldn't have perhaps happened yet, though it may have. But there's not an expectation to have that there when we're just starting transition planning. So we use these assessments to help us write, again, goals and objectives and post-school outcome goal statements. So that PSOGS, P-S-O-G-S, is post-school outcome goal statements. We're going to talk a little bit more about them in a minute. So you will see on page 6, number 3 of the transition planning page is where the assessments would be listed. And then we want to add the results to that present level of performance pages, so pages 4 and 5. And okay, yeah, so we can use several different assessments, and we should use several different assessments to gather information as the student processes through high school and transition. So transition assessments can look like the following things. So they can be interviews, they can be vocational evaluations, inventories, they can be job shadowing experiences or situational assessments. They can be taking a student out into the community, as simple as that, and assessing how things go with different experiences in the community. And they can be volunteer and paid work. One of the challenges that we frequently see with transition assessments is that these types of assessments, these very informal assessments, don't always translate to adult services. So adult services looks at a little bit more of a formal assessment process, and they don't always accept these more informal assessments, and that can be a bit of a gap in between high school and adult services. But just to know that it can be a very informal process, and that does meet the district's requirements under the law. And then we want to look at as many areas as possible. And so not all of these areas may be appropriate for each student, but these are the areas that in our transition assessment manual that we're working on revising. We're really taking a look at what do we need to assess, what assessments are available to look at all of these different areas. We've added technology. So in the old manual, we didn't have technology, and we're adding technology at this point because it's such a major part of all of our lives that we really need to take a look and see what can be a support to a student with a disability. And then this is page 6, the transition planning page. So number 1 is either it's appropriate to be planning for transition or not. And so you should see one of those boxes or the other checked. 2 is was the student invited to attend the PPT meeting, and did the student attend? So they have to be invited. So 2A should always be yes, but they don't have to attend. I hope that they do attend, but they don't have to attend. And so that may be yes or no. And then how did we collect the students' preferences and interests? You know, did we do personal interviews? Did we talk to them? Did they make comments at the meeting? Some students do a whole presentation at the meeting. Some students run the meeting. So that would be a way that we are looking at their preferences and interests. And then a little summary of what their preferences and interests are as they relate to transition planning. And then number 3 is where the assessments would be reported. So this is what we were just talking about. And so one of the things to note is the assessments should be over and above what all students receive. And so all students typically have some sort of career, like a career cluster or some sort of career assessment. Interests, inventories, things like that are typically given to all high school students. And so if appropriate, students that have IEPs should participate in all of those assessments as well, to the greatest extent possible. In addition, students who have an IEP should be given assessments that are over and above what all students receive. So we're really looking, we're digging a little bit deeper with students with disabilities, and we're really looking at preferences, interests, strengths, needs at a much deeper level so that we can support them in obtaining the skills that they need to transition to adult life. And then 4 is agency participation. Were any outside agencies invited? Did they attend? And have they agreed to provide or pay for any services? And typically, you know, at one time many years ago, Department of Developmental Services, Bureau of Rehab Services, some of the colleges had staff that were able to attend PPT meetings for at least the year or 2 before the student exited district services. That's because of capacity issues and just not having as many staff members and having more people on their caseloads. Generally, we don't see agency staff attending unless it's right toward the end. There are, of course, exceptions to that, but I just don't want people to be surprised that we're talking about agency staff, but they may or may not be attending. And then 5A, B, and C are those post-school outcome goal statements. So they're fondly known as PSOGs, P-S-O-G-S. And we look at all of those areas. So if you remember that very first slide about the purpose of the law, we're looking at the area of post-secondary education and training. We're looking at the area of employment, and we're looking at the area of independent living skills. And so I have another slide about post-school outcome goal statements, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about them at this moment. And then we need to think about the course of study needed to assist the child in obtaining their transition goals and objectives. And so this is one of the reasons why we suggest and we encourage families to request transition planning at the age of 14 instead of the age of 16. And if you remember in if you participated in the first webinar, if appropriate, we can start transition planning at an earlier age than 16. And so the reason why we want to think about this is because generally students are in 8th grade transitioning to high school when they're 14, around the age of 14. And we really want to think about what course of study is important for this person, what classes they need to take, what classes, you know, we might think about some exemptions for students from particular classes, but if we're thinking far enough into the future, when we're making these decisions, we are being very thoughtful about how they will impact this person as they exit high school or transition out into the adult world. And then age of majority, transfer of rights. When a student turns 18, the rights will transfer to them. More about that in the Part 1 webinar. We talk about how to work with that. And the summary of performance, which I will also touch on at the end. So that's page 6, the transition planning page. So a little bit about those post-school outcome statements. So I had pointed out, number 5, A, B, and C. That's where the post-school outcome goal statements will be written in. So students must have at least two post-school outcome goal statements. So it's a requirement to have one in the area of post-secondary education and employment, and it's required to have one in the area of employment. And then independent living is the third area, and that is if it's appropriate for the student. So for each post-school outcome goal statement, so if we have 2 or 3, there must be at least one measurable annual goal and objective page, if you will. So page 7. So page 7 must align with the post-school outcome goal statement. So here's page 7. It's the regular measurable annual goal and objectives page that students have had the entire their entire career that they've had an IEP. And if you look up at the top, you'll see the check boxes. And so how do I know if I have a goal page aligning with my post-school outcome goal? I look up at the top here and I see, okay, so post-secondary education and training. So at least one of these pages should have that box checked. And then employment, so at least one page with employment checked, and then independent living if appropriate. So, so post-school outcome goal statements are goals that the student would like to achieve in the future. So this is sort of the target. Where are we going? And so if we are, one of my coworkers uses the idea of going on vacation. So the post-school outcome goals are the goal of where we're going on vacation, so wherever that is. And then the measurable goals and objectives are what we need to pack in our suitcase in order to be ready for the goal of whatever the vacation is. And so it's the measurable annual goals and objectives are what is supporting this post-school outcome goal statement. So this is what I just said, the child hopes to achieve after leaving post-secondary school. And then again, the page 7, so you can look up at the top and see what area each page covers. And then lastly, the summary of performance. So I want to be clear that the summary of performance is actually not part of the IEP documents. The IEP is a legal document, and the summary of performance I put into this presentation because it makes sense and because the summary of performance doesn't often show up in other places. But I just want to be clear that it's actually not a part of the IEP. So this will be a document that the student will receive once they exit. So if they age out or if they receive a diploma, and it outlines what things assisted the student to meet their goals while they were in school. So, so it can assist the student in going on to higher education, training, and employment. And the point of this for a long time was to help a student receive accommodations and modifications in college or university or whatever post-secondary education they chose. And Department of Developmental Services and Bureau of Rehab Services would look at this to see, okay, what worked, what didn't work, what assistive technology did this person use, what accommodations and modifications did they use in high school. I can tell you now, there are many colleges and universities that do not look at the IEP document or the summary of performance. And there are some that do. There are, of course, exceptions to that. So I don't want to make a blanket statement here. But oftentimes, the colleges, universities, and post-secondary programs want actual evaluations so they can see the impact of the student's disability to then decide accommodations and modifications. And so hopefully, if possible, if appropriate, the student is involved in the creation of the summary of performance, because this will help them have a better understanding of their strengths, of their needs, of the accommodations and modifications that they used. And it can be very beneficial to them as they move on to the adult world, so that they have a better understanding of what they will advocate for as they move on into the adult world. And so last but not least, here's some more information, some websites that have a lot of information about transition. CPAC's new website, the State Department of Education just redid their website. And so as you look for information, these can be some good places to start. And so that is all of the formal presentation. And so I'm going to open it up to questions now. So if you have questions. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the chat box. Go to the Q&A section. Okay, don't see any questions in Q&A. You can also, I believe there's an option to raise your hand. Okay, so Irene raised her hand. So I'm going to unmute you, Irene.
Hey, Beth.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. You unmuted yourself.
So can you give us an example of the types of evaluations that a post-secondary school might like to see? I understand it would probably vary per school, but what would some of the examples be?
So you mean what, let me shrink this down so the captioning will show. So when we're talking about going to college, university, or a post-secondary program, what kinds of things? So like I said, there are some that will look at the IEP, that will look at the summary of performance. And what most places are looking for at this point are those formal evaluations. So IQ test, functional or academic achievement, those kinds of things. So they want to know, because they're under the Americans with Disabilities Act approving accommodations and modifications. So they really need to see some formal documentation that says yes, this person has a disability and requires these not modifications, these accommodations to be successful. So we're going to level the playing field for this person, but we want to make sure that this person actually has a disability. And so
Okay.
one of the reasons why they started doing that is because, you know, I hate to even say this, but it happens where a student actually didn't use their accommodations that were in their IEP or on their summary of performance, but then they're asking for it in college. Or even worse, a student didn't have any accommodations in high school, but then all of a sudden all these accommodations are showing up on the IEP or the summary of performance because the parent and or the student may have pushed for those things so that the student could have a little step ahead of everybody in college or at university or in a post-secondary program. So that's why many colleges have stopped looking at the IEP, and I'm sure there are other reasons. But yeah, those more formalized assessments that you would see like in a triennial evaluation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, anybody else? Just pop over and see if there's any questions on Facebook. Yeah, so the other pages that I just wanted to mention, it depended on Tom. Let's see what Tom. Tom, can
Hey,
you?
Beth.
Hi.
Hey, real quick, I just thought of a question actually. Going back to the like when the outside agencies potentially come to those transition meetings or involved,
Yeah.
who tends to invite them? Is that both school district and parent? Like who tends to have the responsibility there?
Yeah, so typically if there's not been any involvement at all, usually what I see is the school district doing that. However, there are definitely times where the parent is inviting agencies in. So if it's the, typical DDS, BRS, and the schools generally have a connection with them, then sometimes it's going through that avenue. But I have seen, in particular recently, there was a student that was getting involved with the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, and the school didn't have a connection there, and so the family invited the agency in. So that's typically, it really depends, but that's generally how it happens. It's generally the school.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. And then there's a Q&A. Okay, so question: if you have a child with high functioning autism who may be academically on par with peers, but nowhere near socially ready for adult life, how best would you advocate for services from the school as transition nears? Yes, that is an extremely common scenario. So child who has high functioning autism, does really well academically, is carrying their own academically, but is struggling socially and has difficulty navigating social situations. So that is really where that functional piece comes in. And so if we are only looking at a child in the academic area, then they might look really good and ready to exit and ready to go on to whatever they choose to go on to in adult life. But then when we start looking at those functional pieces, and so I'm going to back up on the slides here. And so when we are talking about transition assessment, we're looking at academics. That is just one bullet point on this list. So we also need to look at obtaining and maintaining employment. So if we have somebody who's struggling socially, that could definitely be a challenge. Post-secondary education and training. So how do they navigate the college campus? Most importantly, if they are doing really well academically, but they can't speak with an adult that they don't know, how are they going to go to a professor and advocate for the accommodations they need if they're not able to, first of all, have an understanding of what they need, and second of all, talk to adults that they don't know. So students, I've heard this a bunch of times too, students do really well within the school, people that they've known for many years, you know, they see almost every day, and they can do a great job with self-advocacy there. But then you take them out of that comfortable setting where we have a lot of, you know, the safety nets, and they don't do quite as well. And so those are important things to look at. So assessing, asking for assessments. So the question was, how do you advocate for that? So asking for assessments in these areas, obtaining and maintaining employment, post-secondary education and training, independent living skills and activities of daily living, community participation, health, self-determination, self-advocacy, communication, social skills and interpersonal relationships. There are assessments that cover all of these areas. The other really basic place to start is the Connecticut Core Transition Skills. So I can add that to when I post this webinar, I'll add that to the materials that we suggest. The Connecticut Core Transition Skills have several different areas to look at. Before a student exits, we need to make sure that they, you know, that we've looked at all of these areas and that they are prepared in the areas that they need to be prepared in. And next month's webinar is on guiding documentation around transition planning, and the Connecticut Core Transition Skills will be one of those documents that we'll highlight. So I hope that answers that person's question. Definitely looking at that functional area, a person's functional achievement. Anybody else have any questions? Just checking Facebook. So a couple other pages that guide transition planning to a much lesser extent on the IEP that I just want to mention for you to take a look at. So the cover page of the IEP will list the reason for the meeting, and when a student, you know, when we begin transition planning should be checked on the cover page. So if you're looking at your child's IEP, you can look there to see if that's in the forefront of planning. I mentioned accommodations and modifications several times throughout this presentation, and we have page 8, which is the accommodations and modifications page. I can just say quickly that if you have a child that is planning on going off to college, then we should not have, as they are junior, senior year, we should really be backing off of modifying curriculum and look at the accommodations that they may receive under the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's a whole nother presentation, but it's just something to think about. And then page 10 is the special factors, progress reporting, and exit criteria page. And that is a reporting page, but that will give you information about a student exiting and transition planning as well, if you take a look at that page. So, I mean, really all of the pages of the IEP should support transition planning in different ways. But these are the ones that we really look at the most with families as they call CPAC and ask for help navigating transition, secondary transition. So if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to end. Let me just double check, make sure I answered all this question. Okay, so I want to thank you all for joining me this morning for this webinar, and it should be available in about a week on CPAC's online learning opportunities section of the website. And if you have questions about anything we talked about today or transition in general, you're welcome to call the office. The phone number up, it's 860-739-3089. And you could also email me if you have any questions. My email address is B as in boy, REEL @cpacinc.org. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great day.